Hello and welcome to another episode of Oh What a Lovely Podcast, where popular culture meets the First World War. I'm Angus Wallace, and as ever joining me is Jessica Meyer, Chris Kempshaw, and with us today is Helen Brooks. And today we're going to be discussing theatre in Britain at the time of the First World War. Hello, Helen. Welcome.
Hello. Thank you.
Before we get to theatre, Helen, do you want to tell us your background as a historian, and how did you come to focus on the subject of theatre?
That's sort of relatively easy, I suppose, because my background is that I did all my degrees were in theatre. I wanted to be an actor. I was going to go be an actor. I tried that, and then I realised that there wasn't that much money in it or stability. And I realised that those things were relatively important to me. So I really missed studying, and I decided to go back and do a PhD. And actually, my PhD was in Restoration 18th century theatre. So I specialised on looking at actresses in the 18th century. And sort of from there, I've just sort of slowly worked my way chronologically forwards. And I suppose by the end of my career, I might end up kind of in the present day, I think. The First World War side of things. So I suppose I'd always had these dual interests, and looking back, my interest in history ran throughout my undergraduate, and I'd always, when I was choosing what to do at university, it was always between history and drama or English. So it was always there, and I think I've just been really lucky over the course of my career to be able to bring the two things together. And now I'm sort of going back to some of those roots in working in live theatre as well with my current work, which is very much looking at the ways in which the ways in which the First World War is represented in theatre in the present day as well.
I have a lot of respect that your solution to the problem of the lack of money and stability in the acting world was academia.
Yes, yeah. I don't think it was a well thought through plan. It was more of a, what's the other thing I'm good at? I'm good at reading and thinking about stuff.
So if we look at theatre in the First World War, does the war start to feature in theatre? How quickly does the war start to feature in theatre after the outbreak of war?
Really, really quickly. In fact, it's featuring in a way before the war even begins, because there's lots of pre-war drama which is anticipating the war to come. So things like An Englishman's Home, which very early on is looking to future conflict. But certainly, as soon as the war begins, you see particularly short one-actors which are beginning to tackle all the issues around recruitment, early spy fever. We get, from early August, you start to see that appearing in plays, because theatre moves really quickly. I suppose today we tend to think of it as a sort of longer process of thinking these things through and really shaping a piece of theatre. But if you think about the variety theatre of the day, it could be turned around incredibly quickly. So it was much more current and responsive to the issues of the day.
Just when we're talking about theatre, perhaps it would help if we clarified what sort of things it is you do look at, because we've talked about music hall, and you talk about you mentioned variety theatre, and we have talked about music hall in previous episodes particularly as a recruiting tool, but you're looking at something a bit different, aren't you? You're looking at what we think more closely of as straight theatre. Yeah,
absolutely. Although there's overlaps between them. So the source of the project I've been working on, the Great War Theatre Project, the source of all our data has been looking at the Lord Chamberlain's collection of manuscripts. So the Lord Chamberlain's office was responsible for censoring any piece of spoken drama, essentially, that was going to be performed in public. So some of these pieces certainly would have been performed on variety stages and in sort of review formats, and the overlap between the music hall and the variety in those cases is sort of slightly murky. But essentially, lots of short one-act pieces very often, and pieces where we think that actually once they were performed, there might have been a little bit of ad-libbing and changing of the script going on. But it's the text that has been the basis for all of the research we've been doing over the last 6 years on the project, yeah. And that's, of course, what you don't have with music hall, because you don't have that written text and that written archive.
Are they censoring right from the start?
They're actually censoring, for it's nothing to do with the war. It actually goes back to the 1737 Licensing Act. So censorship is nothing new, and it's only many years later in 1968 that they finally abolished censorship. So there's kind of two different forms of censorship during the war. You've got the Defence of the Realm Act, which operates separately, and then you've got the Lord Chamberlain's licensing. So you've got these two examiners of plays who sit in an office, and theatre managers would send in scripts, and they literally get a stamp, and the examiners of plays read through it, and they comment and they write reviews, and you can find lots of these on our project website. So they'll write a little summary of what the play's about and what they think of it, often very disparaging comments about how terrible this piece of melodrama is, and how really a total waste of people's time to watch it, but have to license it anyway. And then there's some really interesting instances where there are scenes that they will cut, or things that actors have to do often involve women getting changed, or any suggestion of sexual impropriety, which gets cut straight out. And interestingly, certainly for the first 6 to 9 months of the war, I can't remember the exact date, but any representation of sort of lifelike Germans. So you can't have the representation of the Kaiser until you get a play called Gott, Straf, England, in which the examiner of plays goes, well, this is happening everywhere else, so I think you think we can probably let this go now. And it's the first time that you actually see, because he's the head of state, because one of the sort of rules of the censor is that you can't show political or you can't sort of represent real life figures, essentially.
What's the turnaround time for this kind of censoring thing? Because you'd imagine it's going to take a while if you're getting lots and lots of plays in. How far in advance are people having to plan these productions?
That's a really good question. And I can't think. I'd have to look at the database and actually look at. So some of the gaps are relatively short between when they get licensed and when they get performed, sort of a week turnaround. But how early the play was being produced in advance of that, or how, we don't know when it gets written versus when it gets submitted and then when it gets licensed. Certainly you sometimes get cases where it gets licensed and it's like a day or 2 days later that the first performance is meant to happen. But often that first performance doesn't happen where they say it's going to happen, or it doesn't happen when they say it's going to happen. Because when it's submitted with the intention of being performed in a particular theatre on a particular date. But it's really interesting how often that isn't the case. And then some instances where plays actually get retrospectively licensed, where they've clearly been in production kind of below the radar, and then they're actually doing quite well. So they sort of go, actually, we kind of need to license this one before we get in trouble.
So where are these being performed? Are these mainly in London? Are they across the country? Are these plays that are being performed in the front lines eventually, or overseas eventually? So
some of them do get performed at the front line and overseas, but because the data is taken from the Lord Chamberlain's collection, one of the brilliant things about that, and I suppose what prompted me to want to do this project, is because most theatre history tends to focus on the metropolitan areas, because it's a lot easier, newspaper access, etc. Because the Lord Chamberlain literally was licensing every single play. It didn't matter whether it's being performed in a town hall or being performed at Drury Lane. If it's being performed and it's got spoken word and it's in front of a paying audience, it has to get licensed. So it means that we've got 3,000 plays, just around 3,000 plays in the database. About a quarter of those, 790 something, are about the war. So we do have quite a lot that deal with the war. And they literally go to the far reaches of England, Ireland, Scotland. So the really fascinating thing has been to be able to actually map out where different plays get performed. So you suddenly find that particularly melodramas where you've got just this one play and the examiner of plays has said, this is all a bit rubbish and it's the same old thing we've seen again and again. And you might totally dismiss that, just seeing it like that and think, well, that's not an important play to the history. And then when you start researching this, you actually discover that those plays are being performed for years to hundreds and hundreds of theatres. And, you know, for people of their time, it's like the equivalent of a binge box set now that people would have been aware was happening. You know, these were big hits of the day, which we've totally forgotten about. And actually, I should say as well, when I talk about doing the research, I'm doing some of this, but I'm supported by this amazing team of public researchers. So when I set up the project, I put a call out for anybody who was interested in researching the history of theatre during the Great War. And I had this amazing response from people all over the country who were working, and actually some now internationally, who are working doing this archival research using digital newspapers to identify where performances are happening. And it's only really because of this incredible group of researchers that we're able to populate the database and to make these really exciting findings.
Is there ever shifting written criteria that they're working to?
How do you mean the
censors?
Yes, to an extent. It doesn't really vary that much. So it's really sex. That's what they're worried about.
I wondered if they were trying to control a message throughout the war, if they could steer content by changing criteria.
No, so it's not as direct as that. And actually playwrights, because the rules of censorship have been in place for so long, so they do sort of shift over time as public opinion shifts. And so you see plays that get heavily censored or banned during the war itself, or where playwrights don't even bother to try to get them licensed. 10 years later, as public opinion about the war is shifting, you see plays like that. So Miles Mallison's play Black Elle, which has a soldier coming back who is very disillusioned and traumatized by the war. You know, it doesn't even get licensed during the war, but 10 years later, the Lord Chamberlain, the Examiner of Plays, actually comment on the fact that, well, this couldn't have ever been seen during the war, but now, because attitudes are changing, they license it. But certainly, you know, during the period, playwrights know they want to get bums on seats. So there's no public subsidy for the arts. You know, if they don't get bums on seats, they're not going to make a living. So they need to write stuff that's going to get performed and is going to get audiences. So they're not trying to, in most cases, to push the envelope. They just want to get audiences in. So I think lots of the more subversive elements, you have to sort of read through the text and think about how audiences might have responded at different moments in the war.
You said that the two censors working alongside each other. Is there any conflict between the Lord Chamberlain's office and whoever's representing the Defence of the Realm Act? Does the Defence of the Realm Act censor come in and say, no, you can't do that because that's going to not help the war effort, versus the Lord Chamberlain saying, actually, it's just about sex?
No, not really. Well, I certainly haven't seen any evidence of that, and actually nothing in the correspondence that I've looked at. So the two censors are very much, it's quite insular, and they're just looking at the plays in and of themselves rather than thinking about the wider context particularly. So it's quite interesting that doesn't happen. But I think, again, there is so much self-censoring going on already that there's very little really that they need to censor. I mean, things like one play in which a Red Cross nurse tries to take up arms to defend herself, and the Examiner is absolutely not, a Red Cross nurse cannot pick up a gun, so she needs to change her uniform and come back in civilian clothes on stage before that scene can happen, or you just cut the scene. So it's very specific stuff like that, or a scene where somebody gets changed behind a screen and the Examiner is saying, nope, has to happen off stage. We can't have any suggestion that there might be a semi-naked woman on stage behind this screen. And then other stuff there's one play by Dorothy Mullard called In the Hands of the Hun, where whole pages are censored. And essentially you've got Prussian officers coming into a convent and taking off nuns to be stripped to the waist and whipped. And then what do? Then there's something sacrilegious that happens on the altar. I mean, it's really, interesting stuff. But they don't get rid of it. They just say, well, as long as it happens off stage, it's okay. As long as you're just, imagining it, but you don't see anything on stage. So it's really interesting, that kind of going back to the Greek, you can do whatever you like off stage, as if somehow the audience's imaginations are so dull that they couldn't imagine it even worse.
But it's quite interesting given the levels of sort of atrocity literature and atrocity, as part of the propaganda. We think about the sort of promulgation of atrocity stories as a way of gingering up the British public. So the fact that this is being censored for other reasons is quite interesting, actually.
Well, that is because of the religious element. I think what's important to them there is not is the fact that they're nuns. And there's a lot of concern, particularly with the Catholic element in Belgium, of not offending Catholic, allied audiences as such. But certainly what I think we see quite relatively early on, from sort of November, October, just trying to think when the play I'm thinking of is In Time of War by one of the Melville brothers. He's a melodramatic writer. And I think it's October or November 1914, you start to see a shift quite quickly from much more blatant recruitment plays where you're sort of, you should be doing this, you should be getting up and fighting. Oh, and wives, you should be telling your husbands too. And if you feel differently, you should be feeling really guilty about it. And then you start to see the atrocity narratives coming in really early. So in Time of War, it's a really short play. But it's the first time we really see that atrocity literature sort of coming through. And it has, it's a really short piece where you've got a young boy who shot on some Germans as they were coming into the town. And so the Germans come in to try and find who did it. And they threaten the priest and they threaten the mother. And in the end, they give the boy a bayonet and they say, he's got to bayonet the priest or else they're going to shoot him. And so he refuses to do it. And he gets shot on stage, this young boy. And at the end of the play, he turns and he says, I can't remember the exact line, but he sort of says out to the audience, if I was a man, I'd fight. Why won't men stand up and fight for us? And dies. And that's the end of the play. And so it's a really interesting example of moving from the kind of more blatant recruitment dramas to then using atrocity themes to bring out that emphasis. And you see that throughout 1915, so many atrocity plays and so many elements of atrocities which come through in the melodramas as well. So lots of rape, lots of, or not rape on stage, I should say, lots of, Germans threatening to rape women and shutting them in rooms. And then only at the last minute does the British officer appear and save them and that sort of thing. But particular themes which you see in the newspapers and stories which are coming out in the newspapers, you see starting to appear in the play. So there's definitely that kind of feeding off popular culture as well.
Is there a wider impact on the theatre as well through recruitment? I mean, to what extent do people who, actors get recruited, stagehands get recruited? What is the wider impact of the, without going full brush to the colours, of population joining up? Does it have an impact on theatre productions and actors? And is there pressure on actors of why you standing on a stage telling me to recruit when you're an actor and you could be in uniform as well?
Yeah, there certainly is. It's quite hard to trace because actors often perform under stage names. It's really difficult to match the stage name with the names of people who'd signed up. So you see it where you might have references to, people at the fighting front and things in the era and in the stage, which are the two publications for the industry. So you do see references to particular actors or particular stagehands, for example, and what's happening to them, and often calls back home for instruments and things like that to be used at the front. But I haven't done any work on actually looking at the direct impact on specific companies, because companies change as well. So it's such a fluid profession. It's quite hard to kind of see that in practice. I think what we see is, or my suspicion is, there's so many short one-act plays and the kind of variety structure at the time that I think that also gives a lot more flexibility, so that if somebody is suddenly called up, you can fill that gap quite easily in a way that's harder if you're doing a 5-act or a 3-act, main play, where somebody's your lead actor. But you also do see, you see increasing, I think, when you look at the photos of plays from the time, you see that age gap between older male actors and younger female love interests in the plays, which I think reflects that fact that the younger male actors are, off at the front or doing other work.
I have a funny feeling that there's a theatre owner in Scarborough in 1916 appeals his conscription, and he claims he's doing work of national interest running the theatre. And I'm racking my brain now to think if he gets away with it. I have a funny feeling he's given an exemption. But anyway,
and there's also a lot in the papers about how theatre is doing its duty. So there's this real narrative throughout the war that theatre is doing its duty. And Charles Cochrane in 1917 and in 1918, there were numerous sort of commentaries from him. He's a big impresario of the day. He produces the Better Ole, and he talks about, how theatre has done its duty throughout the war. It's raised this much money. It has sent numerous recruits to the front. It's weathered the storm. And there's lots of really interesting commentaries as well, and sort of early analysis really of the value of theatre to the wounded in helping people recover, and therefore in also kind of refitting the fighting troops to go back to the front. There's a real sense that theatre has an important, and music and popular culture generally has an important role to play, but also those men mostly in charge of the theatre industry and who have a voice publicly are quite upfront about making sure that that is being heard and that theatre is being positioned as playing an important role in the national war effort.
Just picking up on that point about theatre and rehabilitation, what happens after the war with theatre? I mean, we've talked about, the use of theatre in recruitment, and I'm just wondering what happens once the war is over. Do you get this big gap that we argue happens with literature of 10 years before the war books boom, or is there more continuity there?
What's quite interesting is you see a lot of these plays continue to be performed, and you have a growth in amateur theatre alongside the peace movement during the war, and actually the two sort of feed into each other. So you've got a lot of amateur dramatics that are part of the peace movement and plays being written for performance by peace groups. But you do get things like the spy play from 1914. Oh, goodness me, it's totally gone from my head. Anyway, that one. Which I always describe as having the Bertie Wooster character. It's a really famous play. You get a number of plays like this one I can't remember the name of, which continue to be performed throughout the 1920s and often into the 1930s. And then you also get new plays being written, particularly around the challenge of rehabilitation and wounded soldiers coming back, and sort of questions about how the wounded should behave and how they should be treated. And so you get some really fascinating plays that deal with the kind of after effects and the aftershock of war. And I would say, although Journey's End is the one that everybody knows, that's actually sort of the culmination of a whole host of plays that you see throughout the 1920s that are tackling both the war itself and what's happening afterwards for people recovering and adapting back to life, and how people should move on.
So I remember you giving a paper, I think it was at the 2017 Languages at War conference, which was about an emergence of kind of an oeuvre of horror plays, or kind of along those lines. A paper which genuinely nearly gave me nightmares, because some of the content of the plays that you were talking about. And I think weirdly, now that it comes to mind, I think I've brought this up once on the podcast before. I think it might have been in our Star Wars episode, which doesn't seem like an immediate comparison. But I remember you talking a bit about, a portrayal of kind of new forms of visceral but kind of creepy horror that are all kind of drawing on ideas of like the mutilated man or the facial wound or something like that.
Wasn't it your Grand Guignol paper at the Society conference in 2019?
Yeah, that's the one.
Yeah, that was a fabulous paper.
I've got a chapter on that, which is about to be published in a book on theatre and the macabre, which is coming out shortly. So, but it's exactly that. So there was a short season of the Parisian Grand Guignol, which comes over to Britain sort of 18 months into the war, and which is fascinating for how it's only a few weeks after the first bombing raid in London. They showcase some comedy, of course, because the Grand Guignol does that, but some really gruesome sounding plays which feature things like being buried alive, and they're not about the war in any way. They are pre-war plays which tackle wartime themes, but one of them in which you have a young woman who's actually just died of flu, and who her lover takes a photograph of her because he's a photographer, so why wouldn't you, and then has her buried, and then he develops the photograph and realizes that her eyes are open, the photograph. So has she been buried alive? And he sends his friend along. His friend won't let him go to check whether this is the case. And we, as an audience, see that the coffin has been opened and there's all the marks and the scratchings, and clearly she has been buried alive and now suffocated. And I think that's so fascinating, because then when you look at what people would have been reading about in the papers, and the awareness of the extent to which people were being buried alive at the front because of explosions, that kind of parallel, I think, couldn't have been far from an audience's mind. And the way that I suppose that horror works, and I suppose we're seeing this at the moment as well with kind of apocalyptic dramas and being played out and being produced at the moment, that sort of sense of how current concerns and anxieties get played out through horror as a way of tackling them for society, I find really interesting. And you actually have a play, thinking about the post-war, there's a really interesting play about a wounded soldier. It's a sort of adaptation of an earlier play, but it's a wounded soldier who comes back, and he invades the home of this music hall star, and it's midnight and her friends go home, and he suddenly appears out of the dark and his entire head is covered in bandages. And he says to, and she's terrified and, get out of my home. And he says, but you told me that you'd love me again if I went out. You were the music hall star who kissed me and said, go off to war. And I've come back for you. And he explains how he's been so badly wounded that they couldn't even repair his face. So he will just have to go through life covered in bandages. And so that sort of sense of the inability, I suppose that sense of, the danger of what theatre does with all those early recruitment plays, and that sense of how is society going to move on when you've got these gaps between these young, bright young things who are partying and enjoying themselves and drinking champagne, and then you've got these people for whom the war will never go away. And then in this short little Guignol piece, that's brought together in a way, and there's lovely newspaper reports about how people see it multiple times, and it's only after seeing it a few times that they suddenly reflect back on what this actually means to them.
That Buried Alive one was the one that nearly gave me nightmares. So this is going to be a cracking night's sleep.
I was just going to say that it's an interesting one, because there is, in the shell shock literature, there's actually identified a specific syndrome, not so much of, there are men who are buried alive and then suffer from various psychological traumas following that, but there's actually a fear of being buried alive causes its own series of cases of psychological trauma, that this idea that imaginatively it has been built up, and that gets traced back to the Victorian literature and theatre, because of course it's very much there in the Gothic literature of the late 19th century, this fear of being buried alive. So it's a really interesting theme to travel all the way through into the interwar period.
Can we trace a series of narratives of throughout the war? So if you've got an after, so I presume you kind of think, well, if there's a recruitment sort of play and you end with sort of Journey's End, what's happening sort of 1916, 17? How are they reflecting the war? And presumably after the war, then you've got a different audience watching it, because you have a lot of servicemen who've come home and being in the war, which possibly aren't as in those audiences during the war in greater number.
Well, you do actually, and I suppose not necessarily all servicemen, obviously, but you certainly get a lot, particularly in London. And if people are coming home for a couple of days' leave, London theatres in particular very much target their work, their productions for servicemen coming home on leave. If you turn up in uniform, you get reduced price tickets, for example. And you've also got theatres which will put over whole performances or reductions for wounded servicemen as well. So you do have that real mixture in audiences in some parts of the country, but not everywhere. I think what's quite interesting thinking about the themes, I'm writing a book on this at the moment, is that you have some elements that you can almost you can see waves of things happening at different points in the war. So things like the spy dramas, which are really huge in the first few months of the war, when there's all that hysteria about spies, that actually that sort of dominates for a bit, and then it gets overtaken by some of the other themes. But then towards the end of the war, it comes back again. So it never fully disappears, but you get these sort of waves of different themes coming through. The other things that you start to see happening, so from late 1915 onwards, you get a whole spate of plays which really focus on the home front and the duty of people on the home front to save their money, to not go on strike, all these political issues that are, again, current for audiences at the time. You get a number of plays that really tackle those specifically. So you get lots of war bonds plays about the importance of thriftiness and saving and the dangers of not doing that. You start to get plays which look to the end of the war and the need to prepare for the end of the war. And then from sort of mid-1916, you start to see trench plays. So sort of precursors of Journey's End. You start to see some really interesting plays. They start off as short one actors, and they really culminate, I would say, with the Better Ole, which then becomes this huge phenomenon from August 1917 onwards and carries on through to the end of the war. And that's the play which is, the three Tommies from Bairnsfather's cartoons brought to life on stage. And it becomes an absolute phenomenon. But you see the precursor of that in a number of short sketches that Bairnsfather writes for variety shows, such as Flying Colours, and also some other veterans who are also writing short plays. So there's a really interesting little one called A Gas Attack, which is written by an officer. And it's just a short little piece, which basically is a bunch of blokes in the trenches experiencing a gas attack. Sort of says what it does on the tin, but it's not that dissimilar to the sort of thing that you see in Journey's End. So you do start to see those things coming through from around 1916 onwards, and then they really take off, as I say, with the Better Ole. But you then get sort of attempts to copy the Better Ole with some other productions, but those die out really as soon as the war ends. So once the war ends, a number of these productions just come to a halt, but it's the melodramas that continue. And partly because I think really the melodramas, they adapt to the context of the war. So the villains, become German Prussians, and your heroine becomes a Red Cross nurse, and your hero, becomes a Tommy. But actually the structure of the melodramas and narratives in most of the melodramas are exactly the same kind of things that we see in Victorian and Edwardian melodrama. So it's a really adaptable form, which, has stood the test of time. And that continues after the war as well, where, a lot of these plays that are still in that wartime sort of thematically, but they continue right through the 1920s and really popular. And then you see, some of them where there starts to be concern that as the mood is changing, the audiences are going to see these plays and are getting riled up about the enemy, and that it's sort of keeping people stuck in the past and not enabling people to kind of adapt to the post-war peace. And so there begins to get that tension between new plays being written, which are very much about peace and about looking forwards, and then these wartime plays, which remind people of how they felt during the war, and where you get audiences who are booing the Germans, and that this doesn't quite fit with where we are now in society.
Is there a shift in who's writing the plays? Is from non-service personnel to ex-service personnel? And I'm thinking of Sherriff as, and Bairnsfather for that matter, as men who served. Is there a point at which you can say, actually, we start to see these plays being produced by people who lay claim to have been there, have that authentic voice? Or is this not something that happens so much with theatrical writing?
So the kind of trench plays, as I call them, absolutely. And it's really central to them that the authors and even the performers in some cases, or the stage designers, because Bairnsfather does the original stage sets for Better Ole. It's really important in the advertising and the way that the plays are positioned that they are coming from a place of authenticity, that they are presenting the real thing as experienced by those men who were at the front. With other plays, not so much. So other plays, what's been really interesting doing this project is that when we originally put together what was an Excel spreadsheet of all the data and the lists of all the playwrights, the vast majority of them, never heard of them, no idea who they were. A few key names come up, like J.M. Barrie, writes a number of plays during the war. Pinero, Arthur Wing Pinero, writes a couple of pieces. So there's a few sort of familiar names, but the vast majority of these playwrights totally forgotten and unknown to us now. And so the work that a lot of volunteers have been doing is actually working through things like Ancestry and Find My Past to work out who these people were and if they had a service record and if they were prolific playwrights or not. And you get some where they're clearly, one-off turning their hand to a bit of playwriting because they feel really strongly about an issue, and others where, some women in particular that are names that have just been sort of lost to us, who are clearly massive, successful producers of theatre. They're writing, they're producing, they're acting in these, they're taking their companies on tour. And things like that tend to be, established theatrical families, theatrical impresarios doing their work. So I would say, where it's important for it to be a kind of an authentic war representation, yes, you certainly see it being really central that they can speak to having some experience, but otherwise less so.
Does Spanish flu begin to appear as a plot point in any of these productions? I mean, without wanting to draw kind of too many comparisons between the episode as we recorded and the past. Obviously, going to the cinema or going to the theatre during the Spanish flu, probably a little on the risky side. But does it begin to appear as a concept or as an idea in kind of either wartime or post-war productions?
Not particularly that I've come across. I should say the kind of intensive work I've done has been up to the end of the war in terms of tracing every single play. And then in the post-war period, I've been sort of picking and choosing which plays to look at. But certainly in the ones that deal with the war and the kind of aftermath of the war, it's certainly not something that I picked up on at all, which I think is quite interesting. No, I don't know where to go with that actually, because it's really, and it's something I've sort of reflected on a bit, and whether it's just that actually the war was still that dominant experience, and that's where the kind of parallel to today is. I mean, I should say that I think what's been really interesting for me over this last year has been seeing those moments where the current situation has started to feed into popular culture. So when you first, when Staged with David Tennant and Michael Sheen was first produced, and then seeing some of the things that have popped up on Netflix and how contemporary popular and middlebrow culture is responding to the current circumstance, I think has been a really interesting parallel for me to thinking about why theatre and how theatre tackled the experience of the war. Because up until starting this project, there'd been very, very little that had looked at theatre during the First World War. And I think the kind of standard sort of expectation was, well, it did its job in recruiting and it entertained people, but it didn't really tackle the topic of the war. And I think, looking at the fact that between a quarter and a third of all plays did tackle the theme of the war, you really see how, yes, they're not showing the full horror in the way that we might expect plays to do now because of the distance we have from it, but plays are really exploring a whole host of different aspects of what it was to live through that, and to live through that on a daily basis and also get on with the rest of your life as well.
The intriguing thing is it's bridging that gap between home front and, the trenches in France, and the fact that if people are watching it, almost like we might watch a news report to see what something is like, when people can't do that, if you can go to the theatre and it gives you some idea, and if you can add some form of authenticity from the author that he was there and this is what it was like, it gives those people at home something to cling on to of, well, I know what it might have been like.
Well, that's exactly what you see with the Better Ole, and what Cochrane really sells it as well, is that there's lovely newspaper reports about things like, mothers going along to see it with their sons on leave, and the son going, it's just like that out there, mum. And she's got a tear in her eye, and she can now understand what it is for her son to be out there. And of course, it's nothing like it would have really been out there. But the play, I think, kind of bridged the gap between, kind of touching on some of the horror of the aspect and the drudgery of it, but also doing it in that sort of light-hearted Bairnsfather way, which worked in a way for both sides, that actually it became a mechanism for, or it was presented at least as being a mechanism by which people could say, well, if we go see the play, that'll give you an insight into it, and we don't need to sit and talk about it for hours on end. So I think that there's definitely something about how particularly plays like that become a sort of bridge between the home front and the fighting front, and a way of tackling that sort of chasm of understanding that you see and that lots of people have talked about.
I wonder then, with that in mind, how much plays are filling in particular puzzle pieces alongside things like the 1916 Battle of the Somme documentary, that were actually what you end up with is a contemporary pop culture kind of response to the war of the Better Ole gives you an element of an insight into bits of it and a little bit of the humour. The Battle of the Somme gives you documentary footage, and all of these things add up together to target the audience in a way that, if you transfer it into a modern multimedia campaign, is something that we could kind of almost partially understand, that these plays are if not designed to be viewed alongside this other material, they are filling in a gap that the other material is also working towards.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, Chris. I think you certainly see that with some of the spy melodramas in particular, they're picking up on actual current spy stories, and audiences would have recognised Carl Lodi, and this is clearly a reference to him in the play that I can't remember the name of, and put those pieces together in watching it. And there's some other, well, they're not even plays, they're sort of troupes, which are really fascinating. So you get things like the Jutland Boys, who are purportedly a group of 10 Jutland veterans who put together a sort of variety act and go on tour. And then you get competing, I've forgotten the name of them, there's the Jutland Boys, and then there's another group who sort of compete with them, but it turns out none of them are actually veterans, and they're just entirely fabricating the whole thing. But this sort of sense of kind of bits that people would have known about real life, and a sense of what had actually happened, the way in which the theatre's connecting to that. And you get plays about Jutland, you get plays about Jack Cornwall, which kind of take his story and imagine it as it might have been. And Edith Cavell as well, you get a play which presents the last 24 hours of her life. So there's this really fascinating kind of docudrama element of it, not in the way that we might expect it now, but certainly picking up on these real life sort of interest stories as well, and then dramatizing them in a way that I think we're quite familiar with really on TV, but feels quite radical then.
Just picking up on that metaphor of bridging a gap, I'm wondering if, and I think you mentioned at the beginning that you're doing some work on these plays in contemporary culture and revivals. I'm just wondering if you could comment on that gap between us and the past, the historical gap, if you will, and what the role of these plays is in bridging that.
That's been really interesting, actually, because when I started doing this, there was a lot of people said, oh, it'd be really great to revive these plays and to stage them again. And so there's been some work done around that, and there's some sort of amateur groups that have taken some of these scripts, because part of the work of the project has been digitising many of these scripts where we've identified the copyright status. And what's been quite fascinating is that some of these hold up relatively well to the test of time, and some of them, but interestingly, the ones that were more popular in their own time don't. And I think a lot of that is because they were written for particular companies sometimes. The playwright might have been writing for her own company, and actually knowing her actors and knowing kind of almost creating stereotyped characters, because they knew that they had these people in the company who could perform it and who could just go with it and create a character. And also because they are so responsive to that moment, and we're not in that moment anymore, and that really creates a big gap. And there's also obviously a lot of language and references in terms of race and sexuality that are just not appropriate today, and that would be really problematic to stage in any way whatsoever. So what's been quite interesting though is taking a few of these short pieces. So there's one little piece called Tommy by the Way, which is written by a man who's serving at the front. So the play first gets staged and he's still alive, and by the time it next gets staged, he's been killed in action. And it's a short little piece, and you read it on the page, and it seems so he's this soldier is sort of somewhere on a road somewhere in France, and he's contemplating giving himself a blighty wound because he wants to come home. And the spirit of the women of England appears to him and convinces him in sort of not brilliant verse of all the reasons why he needs to stay and do his duty. And you sort of read that on the page, and it's quite grating, and you sort of go, oh, this is not sensitive to a man who maybe is experiencing, shell shock, or he's certainly traumatized, he's considering, wounding himself, etc. It's, it doesn't fit with the way we think about the war now. But what was quite interesting, I workshopped this with a small group at Sheppey, and simply because we had a lot of women in the group, we split the part of the women of England into multiple voices. And we had just one gentleman sitting in the middle on the stage, surrounded by them behind him. And as they each spoke the different lines, the whole thing suddenly came to life. And it was so fascinating seeing how something that looks so sort of like extremely patriotic and quite grating on the page and very much of its moment in a way that felt a bit problematic, once it was being performed in a really simple way, suddenly had a power and a sort of a sensitivity that you just couldn't get on the page. And I think that's what I found particularly fascinating is seeing that, that page to stage element and where the potential is around these, but certainly not for kind of mass commercial production today.
So we do need some more revivals of things other than yet another production of Journey's End, is what you're saying.
Yes, absolutely. Definitely.
I went to see Journey's End when it was revived in 2004, and there was a huge press coverage on how this play had not been performed for, decades and decades. Did these plays just fall out of favour and slowly fizzle out by the 1930s?
Yes, yeah, basically they did, and mostly forgotten. There's also in these sort of reviewers tended to be quite derogatory about these plays as well. So not only but, because they're very much middlebrow, most of them, and so not only did the examiners of plays have quite negative opinions about them, but all the critics in the press, there's a whole narrative about how, thank goodness the war is over, now we can have some proper art again, because, the theatre's done its bit and it's entertained us, but frankly, the quality of all this work has been pretty dire. And so that's a very common kind of theme throughout the kind of critical press of the day. And I think that plays a big part in why most of these works have been, even J.M. Barrie's wartime pieces have been largely forgotten. And so I think that plays a big part in it, in that we sort of have taken that on board and we think, it's all, it's all a lot of rubbish that was just entertaining for people at the time, but there's no value in it.
I'm just wondering, do you have any thoughts on any of the plays that were written even in advance of the centenary? Because about the same time that Journey's End had that 2004 revival, there was a new play called To the Green Fields Beyond about the invention of the tank, which I remember going to see at the Donmar. And there, I know that over the centenary there have been a number of plays, not necessarily produced in London or sort of the West End, but as part of the centenary commemoration process, a lot of people did get commissioned to write various things. Do you have any thoughts, or do they compare at all to the things you're looking at?
This is a really interesting question. It's something I'm thinking a lot about at the moment, because I'm writing something at the moment that sort of charts the shift from post Second World War to the centenary in terms of how the war's represented in drama. And I'm starting with Oh, What a Lovely War in 63 and sort of ending up with War Horse in the centenary. And so very much looking at the main pieces rather than a lot of the smaller commissions. But I think there's something really fascinating. For me, theatre is always a product of its context. It's always about actually reimagining what the war might have been like, but in a way that is about speaking much more to the current context and our current concerns than it ever is about, the kind of facts of history as such. And I think what's been quite fascinating in looking at the 21st century drama is how much there's been an emphasis on theatre as a means of educating people about the war, and that real shift towards thinking about, well, theatre is a mechanism for people to engage with the war, because otherwise how are we going to educate young people? How are they going to be interested in this 100-year-old war? Well, let's get them interested by making it entertaining and making it engaging. And I think that ties in with that sort of late 90s moment, you know, like the trench experience at Imperial War Museum, and the shift to experience within history itself. But I think with the centenary, what I found fascinating was that even plays like Oh, What a Lovely War, which was so political in its moment, you know, so much actually about the threat of a third world war and the threat of the Cold War and nuclear Armageddon, etc., that actually plays like that became sort of co-opted into this commemorative moment where they start being positioned as, we are performing this to honour the war dead, and we are performing this because my great-great-grandfather died at the Somme, and this is our way of showing our debt to the war dead. And I found that really fascinating, and I'd love, you know, I'm going to look at this in more depth to see how it plays out. But I think there's certainly something about how theatre became really sort of maybe co-opted as a little bit too strong perhaps, but that sort of sense that theatre had to play its part again in this commemorative moment, and it couldn't be too critical of the war, and it had to kind of walk this careful line between saying, well, war is obviously terrible and nobody wants war, but we are honouring the dead, and, you know, we have to recognise the sacrifice and the nobility, etc. And I think something like Warhorse is really fascinating in that context, because it's sort of so, I mean, I love Warhorse. I think it's a beautiful piece of theatre, but it's also fascinating because the actual, like, the history of the war is virtually absent from Warhorse, right? You don't get a sense of where anything is happening. You don't get a sense of what point we are in the war at all. So it's actually, you know, the sort of experience of war as an idea dominates over anything else. And I think that's quite interesting then to see how that sort of plays out in a lot of the other work around this period, that sort of sense of it's all about that first person experience. What would it have been like if I'd been there? As opposed to something like Oh, What a Lovely War, which was very much about that analysis and critiquing of the war itself and how the war played out, as opposed to what might it have been like for me to be there. And I'm really interested to see with a lot of the other commissions kind of where they sat on that tangent between the two.
Well, I look forward to that. That sounds like a really, really interesting bit of analysis. Oh, very exciting to know that's coming down the line. Although in asking my question, I realized I completely repressed the idea of Warhorse. It's a beautiful bit of theatre, but I have such problems with it as a historian. And quite clearly, when I'm thinking about theatre and the war in the present day, something in my psyche just represses Warhorses as the major drama, perhaps, of the contemporary period in some ways.
That's really interesting, and I feel the same, because I mean I love it as a piece of theatre. And I was at Passchendaele in 2017 at the Passchendaele centenary event in 2017, when Joey the Warhorse was marching around the experience field, and I spent a sort of day whilst we were waiting for the royals to arrive, and we were sort of locked down on this field. I spent a day with my camera just sort of stalking Joey, taking photos, going, this is so cool, I'm with Joey. And so I love all that, and I love the theatre of it. I just think it's an incredible piece of theatre. The puppetry is stunning, but as you say, as a historian, I've got so many issues with the way the history is presented, and that line between fiction and history. And I think what Morpurgo's spoken about is so interesting with his work, that idea that actually he doesn't care what the truth is. So with Warhorse, with the book starts with a picture of Joey the Warhorse, which is based on a chat that he had, that Morpurgo had with a chat with a bloke in the pub in the village where he lives. And the book starts with this kind of portrait, and then it goes back in time to tell the story. And for many years, once the book became popularised after the play was such a hit, people would sort of make pilgrimages to his village hall to see this portrait, which didn't exist because the whole thing's totally made up. It's fiction. And so then Morpurgo in 2011, I think it is, or 2012, had a portrait of Joey the Warhorse commissioned, or a portrait of a horse commissioned, and put in his village hall so that when people could come, they could see the portrait that they wanted to see. And there's a really interesting quote somewhere that I was reading in a newspaper where he says, because it so that people can have the truth they want. And I thought that's just fascinating as a historian. Is there any responsibility to the past at all anymore? Or is it enough just to engage people with the fact that something happened and then hope that some of them, will go off? And I suppose it's like, it's the Greatest Showman and everything as well, isn't it? Is it enough that then people just go off and maybe look at the actual history?
Well, it's sort of where this podcast in some ways started, at least in my imagination, of that, where does the war, this history, intersect with the cultural understanding, which so often is the truth that people want rather than the history as we as historians often understand it. So yeah, that's a fascinating example. I didn't actually know that. I've just always been profoundly grateful that neither of my children has been required to read Private Peaceful yet, because I would have real issues at that point.
That's another one I'm writing on in this chapter at the moment. And the story behind how he takes the name of this actual soldier, Peaceful, and of course discovers later it was misspelt. But then actually, again, people made pilgrimages and school groups going to the grave of I forget, was it Thomas Peaceful? No, it was Tomo in the play. I forget the name of the actual soldier, but this Lieutenant Peaceful. And there are guided tours that you can find online, which are themed around military executions and the story of Peaceful. And those two things are totally separate. There's no connection between the two. And yeah, so I'm with you on that. I find it so fascinating, but really problematic.
The bit the listeners can't see is me burying my face in my hands at this point.
I used to know someone who was a puppeteer at Warhorse. And they used to say, the puppets were fantastic and interesting. But there was a hugely ongoing turnover because the puppets of the horses were so difficult to operate. They would just rip muscles, and that would then be them out for recovery for 6 to 8 weeks, and then the next people would come in. They were constantly being injured by these enormous wooden horse puppet things because they look fantastic, but apparently the puppeteers used to just get horribly mangled by them, which kind of changes a little bit of watching some of the scenes for it.
Well, as we close upon the hour, Shall we put the theatre to bed for now? I can see us having to revisit it at some point in the future.
I think we need to do a staged reading of one of these one-act plays at some point.
Oh, it'd be intriguing, wouldn't it? We could rediscover something and make it hugely popular again. What is your website, Helen?
It is greatwartheatre.org.uk.
So what we're looking at next time, Chris?
Next time, a friend of the show, Emma Hanna, is reappearing to talk to us about music and the First World War. It's the first time we've had a recurring guest, which is very exciting.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that. I've got the book downloaded on my Kindle to read. I've not actually managed to fit it in between all the cricket I'm having to watch.
We're going to have to go away and research lots of clips.
Yes. So, Helen, thank you for that. That was wonderful. And so I guess until next time, bye.
Bye.
Oh, it's a lovely war. Oh, we want with eggs and ham when we got plum and apple jam. One for us, Richard, how can we spend our living? Oh, it's a lovely war.